Are you comfortable? Good. Pull the blanket up a little bit, that's it, and let's take a nice slow breath together. Tonight, we're going to go on a very gentle journey. Not the kind of journey where you pack a bag and rush about. No. This is the kind of journey where you just close your eyes and let your mind drift away to a faraway place. We're going to London. London is a very big city. One of the biggest cities in the whole wide world, actually. It's in a country called England, which sits on an island surrounded by the sea. A grey, cold, rather chilly sea, much of the time. The kind of sea where seagulls sit on rocks looking a bit grumpy. Now, London has been there for a very, very long time. Thousands and thousands of years. And tonight, we're going to find out how it all started, right from the very beginning. But first, let's just get settled. Are you settled? Good. Then we'll begin. A very, very long time ago, so long ago that it's actually quite hard to imagine. The place where London now stands was not a city at all. There were no streets, no buildings, no shops selling sandwiches, no red buses trundling past, none of that. There was just land and sky, and a wide, slow river winding through the middle of it all. That river is called the Thames, and it's still there today, flowing through the heart of London, just as it always has done. It's been there much longer than the city itself. And living near that river a very, very long time ago were some rather surprising animals. Now, you might expect to hear about deer, or perhaps foxes, or rabbits hopping about. And yes, there were probably some of those too. But the animals we're talking about were rather bigger than that. There were hippopotamuses. Yes, hippopotamuses. Right there where London is today. Big, round, barrel-shaped hippopotamuses wading slowly through the water, doing what hippopotamuses do, which is mostly just standing there looking like they're thinking about something very important. And there were rhinoceroses too, great big ones wandering through the grass, and wild oxen, which are a bit like enormous cows, and cave lions, which were rather like lions but bigger and probably with slightly fluffier ears. Isn't that the most extraordinary thing? Right where the big black taxis wait at traffic lights today, right where tourists eat their sandwiches and take photographs of statues, a rhinoceros once had a slow, peaceful walk around. It makes you think, doesn't it? That was about 120,000 years ago, which is so long ago that the number doesn't really mean very much. It's just a long, long, long time ago. Before your grandparents. Before their grandparents. Before anyone can remember or even imagine. Humans arrived in Britain quite early on. Scientists who study old things buried in the ground. They're called archaeologists, and they have a very interesting job that involves a lot of careful brushing of dirt. Have found things like old stone tools and ancient footprints in England that might be as much as 800,000 years old. 800,000 years. That is a lot of years. The early people who lived in the London area didn't have houses. They didn't have shops or schools or cozy beds to sleep in. They walked around from place to place, finding food where they could, berries and roots and things like that. And occasionally, if they were lucky and very skilled, they might catch an animal for dinner. This way of living went on for a very, very long time. But then, slowly, people began to settle down. This happened during a period called the New Stone Age, which sounds a bit dramatic, but really just means a time when people were using tools made of stone and starting to figure out that if you planted seeds in the ground, food would grow. Which was a very useful discovery. Instead of wandering around looking for food, people began to stay in one place and grow it. They kept animals, sheep and cattle, and, eventually, horses. Horses were very exciting when they first came along. Imagine seeing a horse for the very first time and not knowing what it was. It must have seemed quite remarkable. So by this point, the area that would one day become London had some small farming communities living in it. Little clusters of people with their animals in their fields, going about their quiet lives. But it wasn't a city yet, not even close. It was just a few scattered settlements, sitting beside a wide river under a big sky. Peaceful, really. Now. The Romans. The Romans were very important. You'll hear about them quite a lot when you're learning about history, because they got around. They came from a city called Rome, which is in the warm, sunny country of Italy. And they were very keen on building things and being organized. They arrived in Britain in the year 43 CE. That's about 2,000 years ago. And they came with a big army, lots of soldiers in armor, marching in neat rows, which the local people found quite alarming. The Romans had a look around Britain and decided they liked it. A bit cold and rainy perhaps, but perfectly nice. They decided to stay. And they needed somewhere to set up a proper base, somewhere with a river, because rivers are useful for getting things from one place to another, you see, and boats can carry all sorts of things, timber and cloth and food and supplies. They found just the right spot, a low, gentle bank on the north side of the River Thames, where the river was wide enough to be useful but shallow enough to cross. And so they built a little town there. They called it Londinium. Now, Londinium wasn't very big to begin with. It was about half a square mile, which is roughly the size of a large park. You could have walked from one end to the other in about half an hour, which is not very long at all. You could probably do it before your porridge got cold. But it had a good feeling about it, a busy, purposeful feeling. Boats came and went along the river, merchants arrived with things to trade, soldiers marched through the streets. People set up little shops and workshops, and gradually, slowly but surely, the way these things happen, Londinium began to grow. By the 2nd century, which is 100 or so years after it was founded, Londinium had about 60,000 people living in it. 60,000. For those times, that was really quite impressive. And the city was getting grander too. The Romans built a big, important building called a basilica, which is a sort of grand hall where legal business and official matters were dealt with. It was one of the largest buildings north of the Alps, which is a mountain range in the middle of Europe, which just goes to show how seriously the Romans were taking. They also built a wall, a great big wall all the way around the city, stretching for more than 2 miles. This wasn't just any old wall. It was a serious, thick, solid wall made of stone, designed to keep the city safe and mark out its boundaries. Building it must have taken an enormous amount of time and effort. Remarkably, and this is one of those things that is almost hard to believe, parts of that wall are still standing today. You can go and look at a section of it near a place called Tower Hill in London. 2,000 years old. and still there, just quietly existing, being a wall, which is all a wall really needs to do. Londinium was a fascinating place by all accounts. It wasn't just full of local British people and Roman soldiers. No, it was a real mix. People came from all over the Roman Empire, from continental Europe, from the Middle East, from North Africa. Scientists have studied the old bones found underneath London and discovered that many of its early inhabitants came from very far away indeed. In a way, London has always been a city of people from all sorts of different places, even right from the very beginning, 2,000 years ago, which is rather a lovely thought. But all good things eventually have to change. After a few hundred years, the Roman Empire began to run into trouble. It was very large, you see, stretching all the way from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, and very large things are sometimes hard to manage. There were enemies on the borders. There was not enough money. There were arguments about who should be in charge. Eventually, in the year 410, the Roman Emperor sent a message to the people of Britain that said, essentially, "Sorry, you're on your own now. We have too many problems elsewhere. Good luck." Which was a bit of a shock for everyone. And without the Romans, Londinium slowly began to fade. The soldiers left. The grand buildings stopped being maintained. The roads, which the Romans had been very good at keeping in excellent condition, began to crack and crumble. Grass grew up through the streets. Buildings that weren't repaired fell into ruin. Over time, Londinium became quieter and quieter and quieter. What exactly happened in the years after the Romans left is a bit of a mystery. Historians and archaeologists have puzzled over it for a long time. The evidence is patchy. Whatever was going on, it seems the city got smaller and smaller, until perhaps it was barely a city at all. Just some old walls and some crumbling buildings and a wide, quiet river flowing past. It must have been rather eerie. Now, while all this was happening, some new people had been arriving in Britain. They came from the countries we now call Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, crossing the grey North Sea in wooden boats. They were called the Anglo-Saxons, and they would go on to shape Britain in all sorts of important ways. The Anglo-Saxons looked at the old ruins of Londinium and, for reasons we don't entirely understand, decided not to move in. Perhaps it felt a bit too ghostly. Perhaps the old Roman buildings were simply too far gone to be useful. Instead, they settled just outside the old walls to the west. A new little settlement grew up there, which they called Londonwick. The Wick part of the name meant trading town, which tells us something important about what it was for: buying and selling. Commerce. Londonwick was around the area that we now call Covent Garden, which today is full of street performers and market stalls and people eating crepes. So, in a way, the trading tradition has carried on rather nicely. The Anglo-Saxons lived in their London for a very long time, hundreds and hundreds of years. It was a modest sort of place, their London. Nothing like the grand city Londinium had been. But it was alive and busy, with its market stalls and its craftspeople and its... And then came the Vikings. The Vikings were Norse people from Scandinavia. what is now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. They were very good sailors, and they liked adventure, which sometimes meant sailing to other people's countries and causing quite a lot of trouble. London had to be very careful during the Viking Age. There were raids and battles and a great deal of anxiety. At one point, London Bridge was apparently destroyed in an attack, knocked down by a Norwegian king called Olaf and his men, who tied their boats to the bridge and then rowed very hard until it collapsed. Some people think that this dramatic event might be where the old nursery rhyme comes from, which you might know. Isn't it strange to think that a nursery rhyme your grandparents sang might be over 1,000 years old? Because of all this Viking trouble, the Anglo-Saxons eventually shifted their settlement back inside the old Roman walls, where it was safer. The solid old Roman stonework, all those hundreds of years old, came in very useful as protection. A king called Alfred the Great. He was called great for good reasons. He was rather impressive. Helped make London safer and stronger. The city slowly got itself back on its feet. Time moved on, as it does. In the year 1066, a very famous battle took place called the Battle of Hastings. A duke from a place called Normandy in France, whose name was William, sailed over with his army and defeated the English king. William became King of England. He was known as William the Conqueror, which sounds rather grand and also slightly terrifying. Now, when you've just conquered a country, you want everyone to know you're in charge. And one of the best ways to do that is to build something enormous and impressive. So William ordered the construction of a great stone tower beside the River Thames on the eastern edge of the city. It was called the White Tower. Over the years, more buildings were added around it, and together they became what we now call the Tower of London. And the Tower of London is really quite something. Over the centuries, it's been a castle, a royal palace, a prison, a zoo. Yes, they really did keep animals there at one point, including a polar bear who apparently used to fish in the Thames, and the home of the crown jewels, which are all the sparkly crowns and scepters and things that kings and queens use on important occasions. If you ever visit London, the tower is well worth a look. It's very old, and it has a lot of stories. Meanwhile, just west of the main city, a great church had been built by an earlier king called Edward the Confessor. It was called Westminster Abbey. Westminster was a slightly separate place from London back then, but it was getting more important all the time. Kings and queens would be crowned in Westminster Abbey. Governments would meet nearby. And slowly, the two places, the old city of London to the east and Westminster to the west, began to grow towards each other, like two towns that gradually merge into one. The centuries rolled by. One thing that's remarkable about London's history is how consistently it just kept growing. More people, more streets, more buildings, spreading out in every direction like a slow, unstoppable tide. By the year 1200, about 30,000 people lived in London. That sounds like quite a lot, and for those times, it was. 100 years later, by 1300, it had grown to 80,000. People came from all over, from France, from Denmark, from Germany. There was a large Jewish community. There were merchants and traders who had traveled enormous distances to be there. The city was becoming important, really important. One of the most significant cities in all of Europe. Though it must also be said, and we should be honest about this, medieval London was not a particularly pleasant place to live in some respects. The streets were narrow and winding. There weren't proper drains. People, well, let's just say the rubbish situation was not ideal. There were rules against throwing things in the river, but people did it anyway. It was loud and crowded and smelly, but it was also full of life. There were busy market stalls selling all kinds of things. There were grand churches being built, with tall windows of colored glass that would glow like jewels in the sunlight. There were taverns and pie shops, and the constant, ceaseless bustle of a city that was always doing something. And on the river, the London Bridge. By now rebuilt in stone, lined with houses and little shops, absolutely extraordinary to look at, was one of the great sights of Europe. People would come just to see it. London's history is full of difficulties. There were outbreaks of terrible illness. The worst was something called the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, which swept through the city in 1348. It was a devastating time. Many people died. It took the city over 150 years to fully recover. That's a very long time. There were also fires. London burned quite regularly, which sounds alarming but makes a bit more sense when you remember that most of the buildings were made of wood, packed closely together, and everyone was cooking over open flames and keeping candles lit at night. But the biggest fire of all came in September of 1666, and it is called, simply, the Great Fire of London. It started in a bakery. The bakery was on a little street called Pudding Lane, which is a wonderful name for a street. And you'd hope that a street called Pudding Lane would be a cheerful sort of place, and perhaps usually it was, in the heart of the city. A fire broke out in the early hours of the morning while most people were asleep. And because the streets were so narrow and the buildings so close together and so many of them were made of timber, the fire spread incredibly quickly. For 3 days and 3 nights, it burned. When it was finally over, most of central London had been destroyed. Tens of thousands of people had lost their homes. The old cathedral, St. Paul's, which had stood for centuries, was gone. A famous man called Samuel Pepys climbed up a church steeple to look out over the ruined city and wrote in his diary that it was the saddest sight he had ever seen. But then came the rebuilding, and this is really rather wonderful. A very talented architect named Christopher Wren was given the job of designing a new St. Paul's Cathedral, and what he designed was magnificent. A great dome rising up above the rooftops, which you could see from miles around. For over 200 years, it was the tallest building in London. Even today, standing there in the middle of the city, it is one of the most beautiful things you'll ever see. And so, out of the ashes of the Great Fire, London was reborn, grander and more solid than before. After the fire, London spread outwards in all directions. Neighborhoods that had been fields and meadows became streets and squares. Villages that had been separate, little places, Islington, Hampstead, Greenwich, were gradually surrounded and swallowed up by the growing city, the way a river floods its banks and spreads across the land. By the early 1700s, about 600,000 people lived in London. By the end of that century, it was a million people, all living and working and going about their lives in one enormous, sprawling, noisy, smoky, magnificent city. New museums were built. The British Museum opened, where you could go and see extraordinary things from all over the world. The Royal Opera House was founded, where people went to listen to music. The city was full of artists and writers and thinkers, but it was also full of poverty and crowded slums and people living very difficult lives. London has never been just one thing. It has always been all sorts of things at once. Now, here is something rather amazing. By the middle of the 1800s, London had grown so enormous that getting around it was extremely difficult. The streets were crammed with horses and carts and carriages and people, and it could take a very long time to get from one part of the city to another. Someone had a very clever idea. What if, instead of traveling along the streets, you could travel underneath them, through tunnels dug into the ground? And so in 1863, the world's very first underground railway opened in London. Just imagine being one of the first people ever to ride on an underground train, climbing down into the earth and then zooming through a dark tunnel and coming out somewhere completely different. It must have felt like a kind of magic. Today, we call it the Tube, and people in London use it every single day. Millions and millions of journeys rushing through those tunnels under the city, past all those layers of history just a few meters away on the other side of the wall. By the late 1800s, London was the biggest city in the entire world, home to over 6 million people, the center of a vast empire that stretched across the globe. And people from all over that empire came to London, from India, from Africa, from the Caribbean, from China, just as they always had, just as they always would. The 20th century brought some very hard times to London. There were 2 great wars. In the Second World War, aeroplanes flew over London at night and dropped bombs on it. This happened night after night for months and months. It was called the Blitz. Many people were killed. Many homes were destroyed. It was a terrifying time. But Londoners kept going. They slept in underground stations to stay safe. They helped their neighbors. They carried on. And when the war was finally over, the city began, once again, to rebuild. The years after the war were difficult in some ways. Many people moved out of the city to smaller, quieter towns. The population actually shrank for a while, which doesn't happen very often. But then, slowly, London found its energy again. People came from the Caribbean, from South Asia, from Africa, from all over Europe, bringing their food and their music and their languages and their stories. London got louder and more colorful and more interesting. Today, more than 300 languages are spoken in London. 300. Every corner of the world is represented somewhere in that city. It is one of the most wonderfully mixed up, varied, bustling places on earth. And so, here we are. 2,000 years. Or rather, much more than that, if you count the rhinoceroses. And London is still there. Still growing. Still changing. Still welcoming people from everywhere. Still flowing with that wide, gray, ancient river winding through the middle of it all. There are brand new glass skyscrapers standing right next to buildings that are hundreds of years old. There are markets that have been in the same place for centuries. There are old Roman walls, quietly standing in car parks and back alleys, waiting for someone to notice them. If you could somehow show a Roman soldier from Londinium what London looks like today, the lights, the towers, the bridges, the millions of people going about their busy lives, they would not believe their eyes. They could never have imagined it. but they started it. With a small town on the bank of a river, half a square mile, 30 minutes to walk across, and here we are. Good night, London. And good night to you.